We made this.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I am welcoming a new guest today, and he just told me how to pronounce his name. I hope I'm going to get it right. Ray Chmielecki. Ray, how you doing today?
Good. How are you, Perry?
I'm doing good. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, that's like the Americanized version. I have had somebody, because it's a Polish last name, I have had somebody tell me, how do you actually say it in Polish? I can't recreate that unless they're like saying it to me, but it was somebody who I actually had on my podcast who's originally from Poland, and he gave me the correct pronunciation and some breakdown on it, so that was pretty cool.
Anyway, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm also a podcast host. I'm here in America, Columbus, Ohio. I host a podcast called Spoon Mob, where we interview different chefs, sommeliers, people in the hospitality industry about their career, whether it's, kind of just going through their career, their timeline of where they worked, why they do what they do, their thoughts on different aspects of the industry and what they're currently doing now. So I've done just over 100 episodes. Kind of started interviewing people at the beginning of 2021, and it's been a lot of fun. So it's always cool when I get the opportunity to go on someone else's podcast and talk. Usually it's non-food related stuff. It's usually movies, or sometimes it's even been like political stuff too. That's always been a lot of fun, but this one's kind of a little bit of both. I think a little bit of food and film, which is going to be cool. So always excited to just jump on and help support the community and people that are doing cool stuff and in the space.
Yeah. Also, probably a little bit of politics too in this one, because this movie has a bit of social politics in it as well. So, how did you get started with Spoon Mob?
So the short version is just basically, like most people, just kind of working a job, living in the suburbs, all that stuff. Wound up starting to travel a little bit. And when I went to Singapore, because my wife was working over there at the time, she had what they call a short-term assignment. She was over there for a couple months for her company. So I went and visited, and just kind of traveling around, exploring, and realized, you can read all these different travel guides and everything, but sometimes they don't tell you the stuff to avoid, stuff that, hey, instead of doing this, do this. It's very similar, but you're going to have 10 times better experience. So started writing actually a travel guide, got all the way through a couple drafts, was looking into publishers, but I couldn't wrap my head around how to keep it updated. When you publish something, then 2 years down the road, if restaurants that are in there are closed or tourist attractions are closed, is that information obsolete? Is it worth it for anybody, to check it out? So built a website for it instead. And then it just kind of got pared down from there to focus on food. That's what we were building our travels around, where if you go to New York City, the Empire State Building, you can see anytime between 9 and 5, but maybe there's a restaurant that you can only visit, between 11 and 1, because that's the only time they're open for lunch. So that's kind of how we built our travels, and just pared it down to focus on restaurants and chefs and people that were working at our favorite restaurants. And there's a lot of conflicting information when you get into different news articles and stuff like that, different interviews that they've done over the course of their career. So I thought it'd be a cool idea to just have them come on and talk in their own words about where they've been, what they've been doing. And it's been a lot of fun so far. And, we record usually a little bit ahead of time. And so we got a few in the can, and, we keep setting stuff up with people, and it's growing, and, it's a lot of fun to do.
Very cool. How long have you been doing it so far, the podcast?
So the podcast, kind of did a few different formats, and really started, I think it was June of 2020, kind of built out the website at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic started. And then, really started interviewing chefs about their career. I think the first one we technically did released just before the new year of 2021. So it was December 29th, 2020, but it's been, a little over 2 years straight of kind of basically every week. Sometimes we have 2 a week, but for the most part, it's every week we'll release an episode with somebody, and they're usually, long form. We don't really shoot for a time or anything. We just kind of go until either they run out of time or, we run out of questions to ask them. So it's just the format that I like. So it's, that's kind of how we do it. And it's been a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you have a culinary background yourself, or are you just a foodie?
Just a foodie. I mean, I did a little, like very little kind of serving and stuff like that with like event coordination and stuff at a private country club I worked at college. So there was like some aspects of that, but nothing, super serious, like nothing like service style at a Michelin restaurant or anything like that. So yeah, it just developed out of just, my wife kind of got me into food when we first met, and, we went to our first Michelin restaurant together and everything. And it's just kind of been that. I have a tendency to, when I get into something, it's a little, deep diving into it and really exploring it. And that's just, been one of the few things that I'm super into. So, yeah, we just keep it going.
Okay, awesome. And so we're talking about Tampopo today, the Juzo Itami's ramen western, as the publicity called it. Now, I know that one of the reasons you suggested this movie is because you said a bunch of your guests have referenced it before. It's obviously food focused. But are you a fan of Japanese cinema in general, or is this just a Japanese movie you happen to really like?
It's somewhere in between. I mean, I've seen a handful of different Japanese movies, and there's some that kind of, for a while, I think they did some like cross stuff, where you would get, some dubbing and whatnot. The big ones, these are not Japanese films, but the big one I remember in like the mid to late 90s was Jackie Chan movies. Like he had all these movies that he did in China, and then they would release them in the US, and they would just dub over. They would do the English dubbing over, so the words didn't match.
Right,
the
just like they did, like
everything.
they used to do with Bruce Lee back in the day too.
Yeah. So, Bruce Lee movies, stuff like that, have seen. So kind of in between, like I don't really, I guess, seek out Japanese specific films, but when they kind of bleed into, what I'm watching and stuff like that, I'll definitely check them out. So, it's kind of in between for me. I do watch a lot of movies. I've seen just a ton, just kind of grew up on movies and stuff like that. So, yeah, I've definitely been exposed to international films and stuff like that. And more so probably than the average typical American has. I think there's a lot of people here in America that don't realize that other countries make movies. Like there's Bollywood in India where, there's the cool, or interesting, I shouldn't say cool, but there's Chinese films that are made where the antagonist, the enemy, the bad guy is an American. I think, I can't remember his name. He does a lot of kind of like B-level, like straight to Frank Grillo is his name. And he did some movie over there where he got paid like just a ridiculous amount of money to be essentially the American bad guy in like this Chinese kind of focused movie where the hero was Chinese and all this stuff. And he was just the big bad American guy, the villain in the movie and stuff like that. So people have done that. And I just don't think there's a lot of Americans that realize that, cinema is a world thing. And it's not just, it's big here, Hollywood and everything, and it reaches, but there are other countries that have their own Hollywoods essentially.
Oh yes, you mentioned Bollywood, and I think Bollywood is the second biggest film industry in the world, and Hollywood's obviously the first. And then, if I'm not mistaken, it's either Japan or China is number three. I can't remember. I know it used to be Japan. I'm not sure if China has overtaken it in recent years. But I think actually for a time there, before Bollywood got really big, I think Japan actually was number two for a period. But especially when you factor in like anime and all that kind of stuff. And you know what the interesting thing is, we still have video stores here in Japan, and when you mentioned the Chinese movies, it reminded me of when I go into the video store there are a ton of like direct to video Chinese movies that are available for rent there, and like lots of like action movies and low budget action movies and horror and that kind of thing. So they've really done a lot in the direct to video market, it seems.
Yeah, you guys also have in Japan, I forget, maybe it's in Tokyo, but it's the last Tower Records, like the actual
Oh,
Tower
really?
Records store.
I didn't know that.
It's yeah, it's somewhere in Japan. But yeah, they're all closed here in America, but it's still there. It's like the last one. It's, like the last blockbuster essentially. So it's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, streaming came here late. I think the Netflix Hulu had been here since like 2008 or 2009, but their selection was very limited. It was a very like Japanese specific Hulu. And like any stuff they had in the US, the most recent thing was like 3 years behind the US. And then Netflix didn't actually come in here until about maybe 2013 or 2014 was when Netflix came to Japan. Um, and now there are a bunch more. There are a bunch of Japan specific ones. Hulu's here, Disney Plus, all those are here as well. And now they've caught up to what the American releases are. So like now, pretty much anything you get on Disney Plus in America, you can also get on Disney Plus here in Japan. One of the interesting things is because I was using a VPN to still access the US Hulu, but now the Disney Plus here, they've got a lot of the Hulu content that's available on Hulu on Disney Plus here. So I could cancel Hulu and still get the same content with my Disney Plus subscription.
Yeah, here in America, it's all partnered, so they have it bundled
Mm-hmm.
together. You can still get standalone Hulu, like I think I have it, and it's just because they were running a Black Friday special. So we did it last year under my account, and it was like 99 cents for like an entire year, a month,
Oh,
and
wow.
and then they upped it a little bit. I think it's like a $1.99 now. So we just like did it through my wife's account so I can get the discount. But there's a couple things we watch on there that kind of come over from your network cable, where it's like I'm not trying to have network cable for like two shows or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even though there's a lot of different avenues that you can get streaming, whether it's people password sharing or some of the credit cards now too. Like they'll pay for 20-25 bucks a month of like whatever streaming fees that kind of they're partnered with. So like Amex, they will pay for your Disney Plus, your Hulu, ESPN Plus, like up to I think it's like 20 bucks a month.
Oh, I should check
And
that out because I actually got an Amex card from the US, so I should look into that.
so yeah, so that's like one of the benefits, and that's a whole game we're figuring out. Like your annual fee for the credit card, like you got to make sure that you use enough of it to pay for itself over the course of a year and all that stuff. But yeah, so everything's kind of bundled, and it's weird because now you have all these individual streaming services. But one thing I've noticed is specifically of late is all the same movies, probably movies that are at least 10 years old or a little bit longer. They're all available on the same services, like at the same time. Like you could
Mm-hmm.
watch, trying to think of something like Hell or High Water. Like that's on, I think it's on Netflix right now. You can find it on Amazon Prime. You could there's 3 or 4 different streaming services that you can find it on. So they're all
Mm-hmm.
like kind of sharing the same like library right now for movies because they don't have any exclusive streaming rights or anything anymore. Where Netflix for a long time was kind of like the exclusive place where
Mm-hmm.
everybody would stream everything, and then everybody started making their own platforms, and then all those deals kind of expired. So there's like this collection of movies that is just kind of available for everybody. For I don't know if it's studios that went out of business and just sold off the rights, that's all they have left or what. And then everything else is like exclusive content. And that's a big thing. Like South Park now, there's a lawsuit. It's not really against them. It's more of the deal with Paramount Plus, and who is owned by like Viacom. They own Comedy
Mm-hmm.
Central. They own South Park, and they assigned them to like a extension running through I think like 2030 for some ridiculous amount of money. I think it was like 500 million or something like that. And part of the deal was that they would also put all the old episodes on HBO Max, their streaming platform, and then
Right.
HBO Max would get like certain exclusive some episodes, and then but Paramount Plus like retained other exclusive episodes that they did. So now there's like a lawsuit going on between like who violated what agreement and stuff like that. It doesn't affect any of us. If you have both
Mm-hmm.
those platforms, you can see whatever you want. But that was in the news like the other day. So that's kind of where we're at. everybody's out for themselves, but eventually there's going to be a consolidation, just like there was with all the cable companies. We'll get down to
Yeah,
like two or three things again.
yeah. That was one of the reasons why I actually haven't used my VPN as much is because of that fracturing. Like a lot of the stuff, it's like this is on Paramount, this is on HBO, this is on CBS and all or NBC's their own app, the Peacock, and then but here in Japan, it's like it's all on Netflix, so it's because they don't have all those different services here. So
Yeah.
it'd be nice once they finally get over that and these other services realize that you don't have to have your own platform. It's much easier to just license it out. Um, but anyway, so today we're talking about, like we mentioned, Tampopo, directed by Juzo Itami, from 1985 is when it came out, and starring a young Ken Watanabe in a kind of a small role. Like I forgot like how minor his character is in this movie, and also Nobuko Miyamoto, who was married to Itami, and she was like his main actress in all his movies. Now, I first saw this movie. It was through a friend of mine. This was actually his favorite Japanese movie, so he showed it to me, and so that was my first experience watching it here in Japan. Actually, what about you? What was your first experience watching this movie?
First time I learned about it was when I started getting into food. I think I'd seen like, it on whether it's Netflix when they were doing DVDs or recommendations or something like that. But I don't think I really ever gave too much attention. But when I first started getting into food, there's a ramen chef here in America, Ivan Orkin, who runs Ivan Ramen. He actually had some ramen shops in Tokyo back in the day when he first started, but he wound up selling those off, and he's just focused on America now for the past handful of years. But this was kind of a big, I don't want to say inspiration for his career, but it definitely nudged him in that direction. The story, I guess, kind of goes was, he was married, his wife passed away. He wound up, always kind of going to Japan, back and forth. Met a Japanese woman. They got married. He was living over there, but was basically unemployed, wasn't really doing anything. And just kind of allegedly, saw Tampopo on, TV or something one day. And that kind of was the spark to kind of lead him down the path of making ramen noodles and stuff like that. How much of that is actually conjecture and true, only he could say for himself. I think he's kind of come out in some later interviews and said like, it's not exactly that much of an influence kind of thing. But he does like the movie and everything. So that was kind of how I first learned about it, and then seeing it from there. And it's it's a different style of movie that if you've never seen foreign cinema too much, it's way different. It feels to me, rewatching it, just a few weeks ago, I forgot how much it feels like a play, like a Broadway
Mm-hmm.
play almost, where the opening shot is not really tied to anything within the main plot of the movie, which is her doing her ramen shop and everything. But then there's just different cutaway scenes where you get that in a Broadway play, where it's you do have the main cast and the main plot points, but they'll throw in little intermission type scenes and stuff like that. The theme kind of fits, but it's not mainly, you're not having some of the main actors pop over into those scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the most striking part to me. It was like, this would do like wonders on, American Broadway. And I think people would really get it, where maybe watching it on film, I think there's probably parts that people are like, what's going on
Mm-hmm.
here kind of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely like this surreal quality to the way some of the scenes play out, and yeah, I thought it was really interesting how the movie. So for anyone who hasn't watched it, the movie it opens with Koji Yakusho actually who's one of my favorite Japanese actor. He plays this white suited gangster throughout many of these little vignettes, and it's almost kind of like a running subplot throughout the story with him and his lover. It starts off with them going into a theater, and they've got these assistants who set up a table with this huge banquet for them as they're about to watch this movie. And then he starts speaking to the audience directly, and then he talks about how annoying it is when people eat in the movie theater, and he goes and threatens this guy who's opening a bag of chips. Um, and it has no it progresses through that. There are all these little sequences of him and his lover, and there's this scene of them having this really bizarre sex scene with them and all these different foods. And then they flash back to the scene where it looks like, I think it's when they'd first met. I think it's that's the idea behind it, where she was this farmer, and that was like the first time they started to have like a little bit of food foreplay there in that scene as well. And it eventually ends with him getting shot in the street and delivering this soliloquy about hunting boar in the wintertime. And it's just such this bizarre sequence that is completely unconnected from the rest of the film, other than the food connection is the only thing that it has in common with the main story.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I think his character is supposed to represent like the. I want to say like the high art form that could be, food, like the wealth too as well, where it's the opening scene, which is really interesting, and probably one of the more interesting scenes in the movie. When they're sitting down and you first start the movie, and it's like, you see him setting up this table and they're opening champagne. And he's got like bodyguards and stuff like that. And you got to remember too, this is 1985. Like, there's no private cinemas. There's no AMCs that only have 12 seats and they're all recliners and in service. Like, movie theaters back then were just, there's a screen, you got concessions out front, and it's full of seats, and it's sit wherever you want. Like, there's no assigned seating or anything like that. So,
and really bad seats too. Like, the seats are not comfortable at all.
Yeah, it's fabric covered, but you got plastic kind of armrests and stuff like that. There's a one cup holder, and yeah, you're always kind of. It's like if you were flying Southwest now, where as soon as you find your seats, now you're watching everybody come in from the entrance and everything, and you're looking and you're like, all right. Hopefully they don't sit there. You don't want anybody to sit in front of you. You don't want anybody to sit next to you, and you don't want anybody to sit behind you. You want like this little buffer, so you don't have anybody like kicking your chair. You don't have anybody's head blocking your view. You don't have anybody like right next to you in case they're talking or opening something. And that's kind of what they were getting at, where, the irony is that they sit in the front row, which is traditionally like the worst seats in a movie theater, because you're like looking straight up at the screen and everything. But that was a pretty cool opening scene that I thought really worked well, even though it was kind of independent from the main plot points.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice to open the movie on that, but it does kind of set the tone for it being like this really weird movie that you're about to sit and watch. But the main story, of course, is this story about Miyamoto. She plays the titular character Tampopo, and she's this widow. She's got a young son, and she's trying to keep up her husband's ramen shop. And one day these two truck drivers, they stop in for ramen. You got the main guy, Gordo, who's always wearing this kind of like cowboy hat looking fedora, and his I guess co-driver or something like that, his assistant, Gun, who's played by the young Ken Watanabe, who I almost didn't recognize in this because he's so young in this movie. But they stop in the ramen shop, and it's the structure of the movie is very much modeled after a Western. So that's one of the reasons why they called it the first ramen Western, because it's this stranger who rides into town. He's even got bullhorns on his on the hood of his truck, on the roof of his cab, I mean. And they stop in this ramen shop. You got this this local tough guy who's harassing Tampopo, and Goro picks a fight with him, gets his ass kicked, and it's this idea of like he helps her out, he helps out the town, and then in the end he rides off into the sunset. So it's got that very same structure of a Western movie, and one of the things is they have the ramen, and the Ken Watanabe, Gun, he notices that when she's getting the ramen ready, he notices the water that the noodles are in, it's not boiling. So and they try the noodles, they're like, it doesn't taste really good. Like, and then after he helps them out, she lets them stay over in the house, and the next day they're talking to the son, And their son's like, "Oh yeah, she's such a great cook," and he's like, "She makes," and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, these pickles are really good," and the son's like, "Oh yeah, her noodles are really good too," and they just kind of get quiet, get very quiet. And then after the son goes off to school, Tampopo asks them, she's like, "So the noodles are really that bad, huh?" And he's like, "Well," and then as they're driving off, she comes up and she like begs him to help train her like how to make good ramen. So that kind of like starts her off on this journey to create this new to create like the best ramen shop she can. And that's basically what the movie is about in a nutshell.
Yeah,
And like, sorry, go ahead.
it hits on like a lot of the points into almost like a Rocky film where it's like the main character loses at the beginning, right? He picks the fight with the guy, doesn't win. Then it kind of pivots to like a traditional Western, helps the damsel in distress. Then you have basically this montage of training and all this stuff. And then at the end is, the victory and then, rides off into the sunset. So it does kind of blend like those two themes, which I think are traditional kind of movie tropes almost of that era of like the 70s and 60s and 80s to a degree too as well. But yeah, like you were saying, like Ken Watanabe, you have to do a double take because you're like, is that him? For those that maybe don't understand who we're talking about, if you've ever seen the movie Inception, he is the client that hires Leonardo DiCaprio and them, and he winds up getting kind of shot towards the middle of the end, and then they go down multiple layers or whatever. But he's like the Asian billionaire figure, and he's been in a bunch of other stuff too as well. But that's probably the most notable kind of blockbuster, maybe aside from like the Godzilla remake that they did here.
Also, Batman Begins, he was in that one as well.
Yep.
And one of the things I say about a lot of Last Samurai, of course, like his big American break, I think it was. And one of the things I say about Ken Watanabe is Memoirs of a Geisha too is another one. Is whatever they're looking for a Japanese man to play a part, it's usually Ken Watanabe they go to first, and then if he's not available, then I'm trying to remember the other guy. But he was also in Last Samurai, and he was in Avengers Endgame and a bunch of other ones.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about because I can't remember the name. Because I thought for a minute it was the guy who plays the man in the white suit, Koji Hashimoto, because he's been in a couple things too. But it's not him. But I know I'll try and find the name. I can't remember. But you see his face and you're like, oh yeah, that guy for sure.
Hiroyuki Sanada, that was it.
Okay.
Yeah, he's like the number two guy in a lot of American movies. If they can't get Ken Watanabe, then they go to Sanada.
Right.
So let's see. What are some things that really stood out to you watching this movie? Some things that really kind of grabbed your interest this time around.
Yeah, so I mean, like you have the montage scene, the training montage scenes, which are kind of ridiculous because it's there's a part where she's just moving this giant pot of water like back and forth on the counter, like back and forth, and it's like that's not really going to help anybody do anything, And then there's a point where I think that they got a bunch of different like pots and the strainers set up, and she's scooping noodles real fast in each one, and it's supposed to be like time and everything like that and speed, and that also like wouldn't help you make better ramen probably whatsoever either. So the part that I thought was super interesting though was when they start doing kind of the reconnaissance and like almost spying on other restaurants and trying to figure out how they're making their broth, how they're making their noodles. Because that stuff is real. Like people will do that in restaurants. That is a legit thing that does happen. I don't think it happens as much anymore. I think the new generation of chefs and restaurateurs are a little bit more open with recipes and everything like that. But back in the day, like that was a big deal. There's stories out there too of just people, wearing disguises and going to different restaurants to try and deconstruct and figure out like how did they make this dish, what ingredients were they using, and just over analyzing every bit to try and figure out if there was something in there that they could pull out and use themselves, not necessarily duplicate whatever they were doing. But with ramen, I believe there are some stories too as well of people copying recipes, stealing recipes too as well. Get somebody that works at a ramen shop for, a year or two. Ramen shop is doing pretty well. And then all of a sudden they go and they open their own one and it's the
Hmm.
exact same ramen, exact same recipe, just different name, and maybe the environment's different. So, it's the new place, new place on the block and people kind of flock to it. And it's like, well, but you'd also have the same ramen like back 2 blocks over where you used to work for like 2 years kind of thing. So I thought that was really interesting how they kind of, focused on that too as well. Um, and then, some of the vignettes, the cutaway scenes and stuff that they have in there are pretty interesting where they have like the businessmen who kind of walk by the screen initially when they're after she gets done doing, I think, her run and her like physical training part. And they have this group of businessmen kind of walk by, and this one guy's like carrying all the briefcases, and then they all wind up in this restaurant, for lunch, and they all order the same thing. I think they order like Dover Sole and like a Heineken beer,
Hmm.
and then they get to the guy who was carrying all the briefcases, like the assistant, and they're all like waiting for him to order, and he's like starts asking questions about the menu and like, well, is this the recipe? Like, is this more aligned with like the French style or? And they're all like looking at him like, how dare you like order anything
Hmm.
else different, But it's because nobody ever asked him. He's their assistant, and they almost like don't view him as a person. But it turns out he knows all this stuff about food, but they're just like worried about, and it's the salary man idea too as well is kind of playing in there where it's like, don't stand out, do your job, work hard, work all the hours, but don't ruffle any feathers, especially with the client meeting, and don't have any individuality in that setting and stuff like that. So I thought that was kind of, an interesting part too when they cut to that scene.
Yeah, that was a scene that jumped out to me as well. And a lot of these little vignettes that come and go in the movie, they tend to be Itami's social commentary on a lot of aspects of Japanese society. And you're right, that was one of them, especially like the whole salaryman idea and this idea of, whatever the boss says is like kind of like, is kind of like becomes like the thing that everybody does. Nobody ever goes against the boss. Nobody ever does their own thing. And when you get to that guy, and then he's showing all this knowledge of it, and you see each one of them, they almost kind of they try to pretend like they're trying to think about something else, and they're like, oh yeah, you know what, I think I'll have, and it's like, do I want soup or salads? Like, I think I'll have, yeah, I think, you know what, I'll have the soup. And then drink, what am I gonna have to drink? Yeah, a beer, I guess a beer. And it's like they try to play it off as if they're coming to the decision on their own, when really they're just copying the boss's order word for word. And then when they get to that young guy, he's asking all these questions. He shows all this knowledge, and he's got one of his superiors who keeps kicking him under the table. It's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Come on. And what I love
But
about
then
that is
also,
the punchline at the end, though, how it as soon as he's done ordering it, you cut to everybody else, and all their faces are bright red.
yeah, and how they did that too is they just turned up like the red
Mm.
saturation color on like the film. Like there's no special effects or anything. So like the whole like everything in the background too is like red. Like so they
Mm-hmm.
could get the kind of emotion out, which I thought was pretty funny. As I mean, it's 1985. There's no CGI or anything like that. But it's like, oh yeah, they just made everything really red for like 2 seconds to get their point across.
There's another point I think you're going to make about that scene.
It was just I think that kind of pivots into to like the lunch crowd. The waiter. He kind of I think when he walks away, because all you would get during that time period for lunch was business lunches and clientele.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not expecting anything significant. Like if you have any sort of lunch special, like pretty much that's what you're going to be cooking. The kitchen's going to
Mm-hmm.
be putting out like 90% of the time. So you could tell that he was kind of bored. He saw them come in and he was just like, all right, and they're all going to order the same thing. And he's like, but I have to go around the room and ask everybody. I think the second to last business associate too doesn't even like look at the menu. He just takes it from like his place and he's just like, I'll have the same. Like he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even bother to play it off, like coming to the conclusion like everybody else did. And then you can kind of see the waiter almost, when he gets to the young guy who starts asking questions like, all of a sudden he lights up too, because he's like, oh
Hmm.
wow, I finally get to actually like do my job and like make recommendations and talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about food for 5 minutes instead of
Hmm.
just everybody ordering the sole and the soup and a beer, and it's like, my shift is going to be really boring and I'm going to make no money here.
Another scene that I liked was when you've got the this middle aged woman who's kind of like this etiquette coach, and she's teaching a bunch of other young women like the proper etiquette for eating spaghetti when you go abroad. And and she's telling me you take only 3 or 4 strands at a time and you turn them around in the spoon and you don't make any noise. And then they've got an American guy who's in the restaurant just a few tables over, just completely slurping up the noodles, and she keeps trying to in, focus on this point as his slurping is in the background. She's like, you can't make any sound. You cannot make any sound. If you make any sound, then it's a complete taboo in Western culture. and it's just this pointing out the absurdities of this kind of etiquette. And then all the other women, they just kind of like they're looking at the other guy, and then when it's their turn to eat, she's like, okay, let's all try it. They just start slurping it all down themselves. And then even the lady too, who's the etiquette coach, she's like almost mortified, but then she starts doing it too.
Yeah, and it's an interesting play off of, and it's pretty straightforward too. There's not a whole lot of subtext in that scene where it's, yeah, in Western culture, you're not supposed to make noises with your food,
Mm.
but when eating ramen in Japan, especially, but I mean, even here in America, if you go to a ramen shop, like it's the lone exception where it's inverse, and if you're not making noises, if you're not making like the slurping sound, it's almost taken as a sign of disrespect. Like you're
Mm.
not enjoying the food, you don't like the food. And that's kind of it. So they're just kind of flipping it on its head, basically. And I thought it was just a really fun way to just kind of point that out and not have to be too serious. There wasn't much you had to read into. It was pretty understandable for anybody, even if they, don't know those facts about ramen or anything like that.
Mhm.
And I think it worked really well. Just, like you said, the social commentary of that aspect, and how it just kind of fit into it, even tied into, the theme of her coming up with the ramen shop and everything and making it better. And it was kind of pointing to the direction of like, well, this is how you should eat ramen versus like, even if you're from America, like that's how you're supposed to eat it here versus if you're eating it in America, kind of thing.
There's also a lot of I think there's also a lot of skewering of upper class mentality in a lot of these scenes. This idea of um, this the proper way to eat food and all that. And so and with this woman who she's saying, this is how it has to be done in America. If you ever go abroad, this is how you have to do it. And it's like, yeah, maybe if you're like in an upper class setting, but really like most people probably wouldn't care. And also I think there's also this idea of and a lot of things. Do you see the movie The Menu? It came out fairly recently
Yeah.
with
Mm-hmm. Very
that
good
also
menu.
had
It's just kind
very
of a shame that it wasn't nominated for really any Academy Awards.
yeah,
Not a
yeah, it was.
surprise based on how they operate, but yeah, I mean that was the best movie that I've seen. Not just because of the food aspect, just because it was different and
Mhm.
the way that they tied everything together. But you didn't really know which direction they were going to go for most of the movie. Like you're like, because at one point, and spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen it, there's one point where she finally gets in the office and like there's a photo of him, and there's a photo of him and a woman in there back from his early cooking days. And so you kind of assume like, oh, is it going to be like she's his daughter,
Mhm.
and all this stuff. And they don't go that direction at all. Like it would be very easy to do that. And they went against the grain. So yeah, I really enjoyed that movie. It was a shame that it didn't really get nominated for any of the awards here, but I don't know. That's just kind of how it goes usually with that stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about that movie was also that kind of class consciousness aspect of it, and that kind of skewering of the upper class. And there's parts of this movie that reminded me of that a lot, especially that scene when they're in one of the ramen shops, and they're talking with the owner, and they're telling and they're kind of like attacking his recipe and all that, and he's getting all defensive. He's like, well, if your palate was more sophisticated and all this kind of stuff, and they're like, well, you're not making it for sophisticated, you're making it for normal people, right? So you don't have to. So you're making normal food for normal people is what you're supposed to be doing. So I like that aspect of it, the idea of this is this kind of focus on not the height of food culture, but just kind of this idea of making the best working class food that you can, type of a thing.
Yeah, and I think that part was also a double-edged sword because it was doing what you just described, but also it was him trying to hide behind that his food was not good.
Mm-hmm.
Like his recipe wasn't good, but it was like, oh, you don't understand it, you don't appreciate it, so I don't have to worry. Like it's too advanced for you, but really it wasn't good. He just wasn't taking any sort of constructive feedback. It was anybody who told him anything different, it was, well, they don't know what they're talking about, they don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, but if everybody says it's not good, then everybody doesn't get it, then what are you doing, kind of thing too.
You mentioned Chris Nolan movies before, and it kind of reminded me of the whole debate when Tenet came out, and he was trying to defend his decision on the way the sound was in that movie, and he was like, oh, you just don't get what I was trying to do with it. It's like, well, no, nobody can hear the damn movie, so I think that's the problem.
Yeah, there's a few different issues with that movie. I think a lot of the casting choices were bad. I think there's a good movie in there somewhere, but yeah, it needed some tweaking. And then I think the casting, they just got all wrong with pretty much everybody except for maybe Robert Pattinson.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was fine in his role, but everybody else, like Kenneth Branagh, like I'm just tired of seeing him as the Russian villain. And I mean, he's done that like 10 different times. Like we get it. And it's the same guy every time. There's nothing scary about him. There's nothing interesting or new. It's just, yeah, Kenneth Branagh, he's the villain. We got it. All right. We've seen this before in Wild Wild West or the Jack Ryan remake with Chris Pine, or like, pick a handful of movies that he's in. It's kind of the same character. He's a decent director, but he just doesn't have a whole lot of range as an actor.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah. Also, I like speaking of the other vignette that really jumped out to me was the one with the wife. So and she's on her deathbed, and the husband's like begging her. He's like, "Come on, we need you to make us dinner." Then she rises up off her deathbed to make one last meal for the family. And this whole idea, I love that, of skewering this idea of like the woman having to give up her life for the Japanese family is something that's even today it still exists. And so just skewering that aspect of it too, I thought was really smart.
yeah, I mean, and that kind of ties into, really, I mean, if you think about when the movie's made, 85, probably shot in 83, 84, you're still dealing with, I don't know how much in Japan, probably more so than here in America, but here in America, 50s and 60s was, homemaker was a profession for a lot of women. So I think maybe it took a little bit longer for that mold to get broken in Japan potentially. But yeah, it was just, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I like Mad Men so much. It's one of my favorite shows, is just because you get this look in this time capsule of how just society changed. Women started working, you get to the point where they just come off of kind of like women's right to vote and everything like that too. And it's, all these advertisements that they're sitting there. It's like, how do we get the homemaker to buy margarine instead of butter? Like, how do we do that? What's the psychology of it? And so like that kind of plays into it too, where it's, for so long women are viewed as, the homemakers and running the home and everything. It's like, well, the guy can't, boil some water and figure out how to make noodles or spaghetti or anything like that. We got to get her off her deathbed, for one more time. Otherwise we're not going to be able to eat tonight, kind of thing,
Yeah. And that, yeah, I think maybe the 80s was when it started to change, and probably more into the 90s maybe, as the bubble burst. But yeah, and it still never really came to Japan. There is still this mentality of, when a woman gets married, she's supposed to quit her job and become a housewife. There is still that mentality in a lot of places. So much so that companies will, when a woman gets married, they'll start asking her, so when are you gonna have children, right? We want to know. And when they get pregnant, it's like, okay, so once you have your child, you're gonna take care of your child, and then you're gonna stay home, right? You're not gonna come back to work. And there is a lot of that kind of social pressure on it, and the system here actually makes it very difficult for women to go back to work with the insane work culture and the lack of really good childcare facilities. And even when they're on maternity leave, I see this happen with my wife because she's still on maternity leave herself, and the company will constantly send her new paperwork to fill out. And the idea is to kind of, use this soft pressure to kind of get the woman to say like, oh God, I'm so sick of doing this paperwork. So they'll either end their maternity leave early or they'll quit their job completely. And with my wife, I'm telling her, I'm like, you're not going to let them do this. She's like, oh no, I'm just going to keep filling it out. But a lot of women, they give into the pressure that the societal pressure. And that happens a lot in Japanese work environments. For example, vacation time, this idea of you have that paid vacation time if you're a full-time employee, but you go to your boss, you say, I want to take these days off. They're like, oh, well, that's a difficult time because, if you're out of the office, then that's going to put a lot of pressure on the rest of your teammates. And so there's a lot of that kind of soft pressure on them to not take vacation time, to work overtime, and that kind of group mentality thing happens a lot here. So yeah,
that's interesting because that used to be America, and I mean it definitely still is to a point, but I think the pandemic really shifted a lot of stuff. Whereas people are just like, well, I've worked for this company for 15 years and I just got laid off because of the pandemic. Like everything that I ever did for them, like what's the point? Like there was no thank you. It was just I was mass laid off with 50 other people in a Zoom call, and that kind of really changed a lot of stuff, I think, in work culture now. Now, allegedly, there's this battle, and some of it's true with, trying to get people to return to office buildings and stuff. And a lot of it has to do with these big corporations have all these real estate holdings. There's nobody occupying the buildings. Cities are losing their tax revenue because there's nobody downtown in the city. They're all staying out in the suburbs and working remote and all this stuff where, big corporations should just write those buildings off as, sunk costs and just pivot. And a lot of the mid and smaller ones have, but yeah, there's this battle, but it's not really a battle because a lot of it is just those big corporations kind of paying people to write articles saying that there is this battle, to get people to kind of go back, and everybody's looking around like, man, nobody's doing that,
I've seen some of those articles. I've laughed at it. It's like, you're. I think the most recent one I saw was like, your commute gives you valuable time to transition to a work mentality.
I think I saw that same one. Yeah,
fuck off with that shit. Come on. I'm like, I don't need to sit in traffic for an hour and a half to shift to a workplace mentality. I don't need to do that.
Yeah, so that's kind of what. But so it doesn't seem like the pandemic really affected the work culture in Japan, or maybe it did. It just didn't enough. But
it did. Yeah,
it seems like.
It did to a certain extent, but we didn't have like the big lockdowns, the mass lockdowns in America. We didn't have that kind of thing. We had some degree of it. There was no, mass lockdown per se. There was a stay-at-home advisory when COVID first got really bad in like the spring of 2020, and it was only for like about a month or two. And that was kind of like the big time when a lot of people stayed home. But after that, it was very much kind of a voluntary thing. And so a lot of it comes down to the Japanese law. The government actually can't enforce those kinds of lockdowns because of what happened during the war. So the government actually doesn't have the power to have that kind of power anymore. So it was a lot of like stay-at-home advisories and that kind of thing. But here and that was mostly only in the big cities. Like here where I live in Kagoshima, which is, more of a suburban type area, we didn't have a mass lockdown. I think there was like maybe 1 month where all my classes were basically online or postponed. But then after that, it was kind of a mix where some of them were back in person after that first month or two. Some of them, and some of them were online. And even now, like I've got a few classes that are still online myself. So yeah, it was this mix of things. And a big part of it too is just there's not a lot of the same infrastructure in Japan for working at home, working remotely as there is in America. Because in America, pretty much every middle class and above household has a computer, has home internet. That's not always the case in Japan. Like computers, the whole idea of the home computer it didn't happen in Japan the same way it happened in America. So, I remember when, in the 90s when I was growing up, we had a home computer in our house before we even got the internet. But in Japan, they didn't really have a home computer. It was this idea of like, if you're doing work, if you need a computer, you're going to be going to the office to be doing work anyway. And there's this whole work culture mentality where you stay at the office late. So there's not this whole idea of taking your work home with you. So you'd have people staying at the office until like 7, 8, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, finishing up their work and then going home, as opposed to quitting at 5 o'clock and then maybe saying, okay, I'll finish some of this work at home on my computer at home. That just didn't exist here. And so when the internet first came to Japan, it actually did not take off in Japan until they had internet enabled phones. That was when people started being able to access the internet, because they didn't have computers at home. So they would only use the internet if they went to like an internet cafe, or when they finally came to cell phones, then it's like, oh, now I can use the internet here.
That's kind of wild, because it's basically two different ways to get people to work more than 40 hours, where Japan is like, no, all your connectivity's here in the office, you got to be here. Where in America it was, yeah, let's get everybody a home personal computer so that way when they're home they can work too.
Right.
But it's still the same end result. It's just two different ways, two different methods of going about it. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that was and Itami, he does a lot of this kind of stuff in his movies where he's skewering different aspects of Japanese society and Japanese culture. I think this movie is fun, but I think I actually prefer another movie he made a few years late, almost 10 years later, actually. It came out in 92, I think, called Mimbo. And that was about, also with Miyamoto. She was married to him, so she was like the lead character in all his movies. But in that one, she plays a lawyer who specializes in the Yakuza, and she like helps this hotel that is being harassed by the Yakuza. And it's this very brilliant skewering of the Yakuza and of the way Japanese society, especially at that time, really kind of tolerated their presence.
Yeah, I've never seen that movie, but I will definitely have to check that one out. That's not something that's popped up on my radar. So
yeah, it's a difficult movie to find. I'm not sure how available it is in the West. I mean, you might be able to find the full movie on YouTube. Sometimes when a lot of these movies, usually I don't endorse that kind of thing, and this has kind of been one of my big sticking points with this show, is a lot of these movies just aren't available in other countries. And you'd think with streaming, there'd be a lot more attempts to get some of these back into print, because they used to be available, but they've just fallen out of print in the years since. So that's kind of been
Tampopo is on HBO Max right now.
Yeah, Tampopo
so if you have an HBO subscription, you can find it.
Right. This is probably his most famous movie internationally, maybe even domestically too, because this is there are a lot of ramen shops all across the country that are named Tampopo. So it's a very popular movie. It still exists very much in the popular consciousness.
Yeah, I wonder what ramen shop owners think about that. Like, is that one of those things where, you come across a ramen shop named Tampopo and it's like, okay, like really, you couldn't come up with an original name? Like you come nothing else? Like you and 50 other people had to go for the movie. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I wonder. I don't know. I'd have to ask somebody.
Yeah, it's a good question, because even in Kagoshima, just this one area, I've seen probably about 3 or 4 different shops named Tampopo.
Yeah, that's wild. That's interesting.
Another one I liked was the scene with the restaurant where the guy's telling this old guy about an investment, the professor. And the whole idea is like there's this retired professor and this younger guy. He's trying to scam him out of this investment. He even goes this moment. And goes make a phone call. He's like, "Oh, I got this guy. He's such an easy mark." And then it cuts back to the old guy, and he reaches into the guy's jacket and starts stealing all his money. And this cop comes by and handcuffs him. He's like, "You're trying this old scam again, huh?"
Yeah, I think the way I interpreted that scene was to do with when someone wants to open their own restaurant and the investment and securing the investment, and you have to jump through all these hoops, whether it's with a bank or private financing or whatever. And a lot of times you can wind up entering into just a bad deal that has either hidden language or false promises or whatever, and it kind of falls through, and you could get stuck or on the hook and using your own money or winding up in debt or whatever, advancing costs and stuff like that. So that's the way I interpreted that, was just kind of the back and forth potential scamminess of, this one guy trying to make a quick buck and get some quick money. And then, turns around and the other guy, the older guy, is really, this experienced quote unquote investor that, is probably going to wind up siphoning off money somehow out of the agreement on his end. So I thought that was pretty interesting to kind of poke at, that whole aspect. That's the way I took it anyways.
Yeah, I think also too, there was a lot of financial scams going on at the time. I think that was probably when a lot of these scam type things started. It really increased in the 90s. Have you seen Tokyo Vice on HBO Max?
Yeah, I was surprised it's actually going to get a second season. And I guess they were thinking that it wasn't gonna because of some of the stuff with the main character, Ansel Elgort, I think is his name. I might be mispronouncing that. But I think he had some like potential harassment allegations or something.
Really?
Circling kind of him. I think do your own research, people. Don't take my word for that on that. Just do a quick Google search. But I think that's what originally they were saying, like, oh, it might not get a second season because of that. And then I guess it's going to get a second season. Yeah. So, because it ended on like a cliffhanger. It was a pretty big cliffhanger. Everybody's like, well, if we're not going to get a second season, like, what the hell? Like, we just wasted all our time kind of, watching this. So, but I saw the first season, enjoyed it. It's a little slow to start with, which was a little bit of a surprise. I mean, Michael Mann's involved with it, I believe. So, and he's not doing too much right now. So it's kind of his latest project, I guess. So if you're a fan of his work, you get some aspects of how it's shot and stuff like that. And Ken is in that as well, too. He's kind of the main, one of the main characters too, as well. So, I enjoyed it, and I'm definitely happy that it got a second season to hopefully at least be able to wrap up some of the story, because there's nothing more frustrating than when you start a show, when it just came out, you're kind of into it, and then it doesn't get renewed, and it's just like, can you guys at least just give us an ending to the story, something like, instead of leaving us on a cliffhanger?
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because of the scam that the main character Jake uncovers in that series, and kind of like the first half of it is kind of the focus, where there are all these different suicides, and he starts investigating. And he finds out that they all had the same life insurance policy with this company that doesn't seem to be a legitimate company, and there are a lot of scams like that. So I think that was kind of a play on that, where the cop is going after the pickpocket, the old guy who's the pickpocket, but completely ignores the fact that there's this other con artist who's potentially stealing much more money from people with his scams. So I thought that was kind of the idea of that. Also, just kind of poking fun at the idea of the elderly being too infirm or too unaware of what's going on around them, when really this old guy is pretty sharp himself, and he's playing it up in his own way. Similarly, there's something similar where you've got this old woman in the supermarket who just can't stop squeezing the food, and kind of playing on these little old women who you see them in the food. They're in the grocery stores. They're always trying to find like the perfect piece of fruit or something. They're always squeezing them. So she's going through and she's squeezing everything. She even opens like the box of cheese, starts squeezing it, goes and starts squeezing the bread in the deli.
Yeah, that one fell flat on me, and I don't know why, but it just didn't. I don't know. Maybe if that's just not something really here, in America too much anymore. I mean, that's definitely, I'm 34, and
Mhm.
that's definitely my grandmother's, generation would definitely do that, and even to an extent, I guess maybe I can remember as a kid grocery shopping with my mom, but mainly it's here in America. I feel like you're checking for like dead spots,
Mhm.
and so squeezing all the fruit and touching all the fruit, like you just don't really see that here. You'll see people like eating food in the grocery store, and you're like, hopefully they're going to actually pay for that. Eh,
Mhm.
Nobody really cares about a grape or two, but like, there'll be people that are like eating half a box of cookies as they're going through the aisle and stuff like that. So that I think that's more of like a thing that resonates with people versus watching somebody kind of squeeze fruit or vegetables, at
Mhm.
least here.
I Yeah, yeah. I thought it was funny because I've definitely seen that here in Japan. So, but I think it was also again kind of the idea of you know old people in Japan. They because they do have a lot of um, respect afforded to them. There is kind of this idea that they can kind of get away with anything they want. So I think that was part of it too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that was like the one kind of cutaway scene that just did not really. I was kind of like, all right, I kind of get what's going on, but I don't. It
Mhm.
doesn't really apply to anything that I've kind of seen.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, were there any other things that you noticed about this movie that kind of jumped out at you?
I think the only other thing, they did a really good job with. I felt the lighting. I thought, her original ramen shop was very authentic for what I think everybody envisions what a ramen shop should and would be. And then kind of at the end when they have it all revamped, all the new construction, it doesn't feel like a ramen shop at
Mhm.
all. It feels very French almost. Everything's white and bright and clean, and that just doesn't feel like any ramen place that I've ever been into. Even if it's a brand new place, like
Mhm.
it just didn't feel right. And I don't know if that was on purpose or if they were just trying to really drive home the point that she turned around her business into this thing that is going to be, this world class, ramen shop that everybody's going to want to be at. And it's this upper level thing. And
Mhm.
even wealthy people will come here because of everything. So that was kind of the only thing that stood out when, they show that at the very end. And you're just like, I was like, that's not, I've never seen a ramen shop look like that
Mhm.
in any, documentaries, films, anything. And I've never experienced one like that. Maybe there are ones that exist like that, but I thought that was kind of a point that really shocked me when you see it again and you're like, oh yeah.
No, that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that because that was something that I hadn't thought to mention, but it also jumped out at me at the end when we see like the outside of her shop, and I'm just like, wow, that looks really different. And when she brings the ramen flag out, it feels out of place. And yeah, the inside of the shop, I mean, it almost looks more like a Western lunch counter type of thing instead of a traditional Japanese ramen restaurant. And yeah, because she's sitting at the counter like that, and there's no. I'm looking at a photo of it right now, and usually you do have that high ledge up there. Very few ramen shops I've been in where they don't have that, or at least some sort of divider between the
Mhm.
the cooks and the customers. In some cases, they might have those kinds of low counters, but they'll at least have like a plastic divider or something. So yeah, that was something that looks very out of place too. I wonder if maybe Itami was because I think that this was maybe around the time when ramen started to become more popular internationally. So I wonder if there was some commentary on that about the changing nature of it and about it growing beyond Japan's borders, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
Yeah, very well could be that it they made it feel Western because it was expanding into Western culture, Western
Mhm.
countries, and stuff like that too. Um, did they ever? And the only other thing, did they ever say what the guys were hauling in their truck? They had like a tanker truck, but I don't, at the end, because
No, I don't
the
think
very
they
end
did.
scene is them driving down the freeway, and you see the truck. You know, you've always seen them in the cab and everything, and you're like, all right, they're truck drivers, and but you never know what they're hauling. Like, I mean, it looked like it was probably some sort of liquid or gas, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think they ever mentioned it. At least if they did, I didn't notice it.
Okay, yeah, I was like, I don't think so, but maybe I missed it somewhere in there. Yeah.
I also love the scene at the beginning where uh, Gunn is reading the book and he's imagining the situation with the old sensei, like teaching him like how to eat ramen. It's like, you have to first, stroke it 3 times with the surface of it, and then you have to gently touch the pork and fold it over. This is saying thank you to the pork.
Yeah, I don't. With that scene, it kind of throws you. I wasn't sure if they were trying to kind of poke at the tradition of things and how people can get too far ingrained in like the
Mhm.
ritualization of it, where at the end of the day, it's noodles and broth. You
Mhm.
know, it's food. You know, you can't take yourself too serious. You know, where it's not. People put certain things in, whatever country, any food fan or foodie or whatever, you do wind up, I feel like a lot of people put these dishes or these foods on like this pedestal of like they're
Mhm.
this end all be all thing. And like, it's like, you talk to a lot of people and they're just like, yeah, man, it's food. Like we want it to be good and it looks cool. But it doesn't, sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes people, can make a connection, but I think people always, sometimes people look for a connection where there isn't one, and they almost make one
Mhm.
up in their head. Like, oh, you gotta do it this way, and you gotta do it. And it's like, there's another way to do it, or you don't have to do any of that. And like,
Yeah,
to each their own kind of thing.
yeah. It felt a lot like if you ever seen a Japanese tea ceremony, it felt a lot like that, but with ramen instead. So it's like the kind of ritualization. And yeah, I think that idea of the fetishization really kind of it jumped out to me as well. And again, it made me think of the menu. Nicholas Holt's character in that movie, was God, just an insufferable piece of shit. And you got to hand it to him; he played that part perfectly. But like just from frame one, I wanted that guy to die. But it's that very same attitude in a lot of these scenes where and I think it kind of pays off with the literal fetishization of food, where the Yakuza guy and his mistress are using food as a way of having sex. And I felt like that was kind of connecting all those ideas together.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, yeah, because I definitely thought of Nicholas Holt's character too, where he's like super into it, and we all can be you know, super into certain things,
Mhm.
whatever it is that our hobby and everything is. But he like, yeah, it takes it to this whole level where he's basically like, no, 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 shut up. Like, don't ruin this for me. Like,
Mhm.
don't like, you're here just because I needed like another person to be here because they only sold tickets in twos. That's the only
Yeah.
reason why you're here. I don't care about anything you have to say. Like, don't ruin this for me is kind of like his whole thing. So, yeah.
Okay, I think those are all the things I wanted to mention about this movie. Was there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I would just say, if you go and if you've never seen this movie before, um, stick with it. I think it runtime is probably like an hour 45. I think maybe somewhere in there, hour 30, hour
Something like
45.
that, yeah.
But keep in mind it's 1985, so we're looking at what, 35, almost 40 years ago,
Mhm.
that this was made. So it's different,
Mhm.
stylistically. It's on film, so it's a little bit grittier. Just keep all that in mind. Life has changed. The CGI wasn't popular
Mhm.
until the mid 2000s. Stuff like that. So I think you have to go into any movie that's you know before 1990. At this point, you have to go into it with that lens of, this is completely different. This is
Mhm.
going to be different. than anything that I've seen, probably at all this year. And as long as you do that, I think you can appreciate definitely certain aspects of it.
Yeah, I think so too. One of the things I wanted to touch on too is you had mentioned in your emails, and I briefly mentioned at the top of the show that a lot of your guests have talked about this movie. Do you want to say anything about the people who've told you about this movie or stuff they've said on your show or in your blog?
I think the overarching theme for those that have mentioned it, is especially during that time period, and even now, there's not a whole lot of food media or food on film. Like you'll have classic scenes in restaurants, or
Mhm.
maybe food as a byproduct. You could think of scenes out of Martin Scorsese movies or whatever. And there's a handful of them here or there, but there's not a whole lot of movies that have been just the whole theme of the movie, the whole plot is built around food. Now you have different documentaries and TV shows and stuff like that too as well. But in terms of cinema, it's few and far between. And
Mhm.
it's, once maybe every 5 to 10 years, there's, some sort of major motion picture that's kind of built around it. But like, honestly, most of, the people, when you talk, food movies, it's a short list. And then a lot of them say, the most authentic one is Ratatouille, which is an animated
Mhm.
one. And part of that, I think, is because Thomas Keller was a consultant on that
Mhm.
too, as well. But yeah, so, people that mention it, I think they can all kind of resonate with certain aspects of it, that have seen it. And I think it still holds up. I think a lot of the touch points still apply to the restaurant industry today.
Mhm.
It's just a little bit different stylistically, feels a little bit more like a Broadway play, a little bit grittier because it's made in 1985. But I think the people that have seen it have all appreciated some aspect of it. And like I
Mhm.
said, there's just not, when you go back through, the last 50 years, you're probably going to come up with maybe 15 or 20 like food centric, food focused films. It's not that many.
Yeah, I think also another one to mention is the Ramen Girl with Brittany Murphy that came out in 2008. Now I haven't seen it, but just looking at the reviews on Letterboxd, it doesn't look like it was very popular. But that apparently had a lot of references in it to Tampopo.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that was not a popular movie, and it kind of ripped off Tampopo in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. It was kind of a blend of like a remake of Tampopo, and then also blending in like moments of Eat, Pray, Love with like
Mhm.
Julia Roberts and like this whole self discovery and traveling and food and whatnot. It's kind of like jamming those two together, which is something that Hollywood is definitely known for. Where let's take this concept and this other concept and just mash them together, even if we're
Mhm.
just ripping off a previous film. Like it'll be different enough, and people might like it.
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody liked it.
yeah. Apparently not. I'm curious of it just for the references, but it's judging from the reviews. I'm not in a rush to go see it because I've never seen it before. All right, so and yeah, it's this is a good movie. I think if you're an Itami fan, I know a lot of people hold this up as one of his best movies, but I mean, maybe it's just because of my familiarity with the culture. But I found Mimbo to be a lot more enjoyable than this, although this is by no means a bad movie. So I think, yeah, if you like Itami's movies, especially, I think you'll definitely get something out of this. But Ray, thank you so much for coming on the show. And why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So you can find us on social media. Mainly, we use Instagram. It's just at Spoon Mob is our account. You can check out our website, spoonmob.com. We have links to all of our episodes with all the interviewees that we've done, different food photos up there that we usually wind up posting on our Instagram eventually. Updates to anybody that's been on the podcast too as well. We keep a running list on their little webpage that we built out for them. And if you listen to the podcast, episodes come out every week on Thursday here in the US. Feel free to follow, subscribe, and you can contact us through the website portal too as well for questions, comments, feedback. We always love to hear from anybody who's checked us out and everything. And yeah, hopefully, there's something in there for everybody to enjoy if, you have any interest in food. But yeah, otherwise, we have a few guest spots, I think, coming up on different podcasts. It's always fun to support the community, just because it is a super supportive community. There's nothing else really like it, where everybody, especially on Reddit in the podcast subs, I mean, you get people asking basic questions that if they did a little bit of legwork, they could figure out. But more than not, everybody's pretty supportive of each other and trying to find ways to continue doing what they do, because people not just enjoy creating the podcast and talking about whatever their subject matter is, but there are people out there that enjoy listening to the medium, and it makes sense as people wind up back in offices and stuff like that and commutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have those links in the show notes. So thanks again for coming on. And that does it for this episode of Japan on Film. JapanOnFilm.com is the website. And we are Japan on Film on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for watching if you're on YouTube. And we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit JapanOnFilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at JapanOnFilm.com, WeMadeThisNetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
"100 years since Nosferatu first terrified audiences on the big screen,
30 years since Francis Ford Coppola gave us Bram Stoker's Dracula,
and 10 years since Dark Shadows with Johnny Depp.
Vampire Videos is a podcast taking a look at this iconic blood-sucking monster on film and television.
I'm Dan Owen,
And I'm Hugh McStay.
and we're here to guide you through a century of vampirism on film. From Hollywood's golden age with Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula,
To the more lurid hammer horrors of the 60s and 70s starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
through to the 80s boom in vampires, which brought these creatures of the night into the modern age.
And everything this century's had to offer us, from foreign and independent films, spoof comedies, and even teenage love stories. Yes, I'm talking about Twilight.
We aim to cover it all, one bite at a time.
So join us on a voyage into the depths of vampire cinema, old and new, with weekly guests offering their own insights and expertise. And why not follow us on Twitter at Vamp Videos?
A proud part of the We Made This podcast network, subscribe now to Vampire Videos, and thanks
Thanks
for
for
listening.
listening.